We started now, participants can see you and hear you.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody in the room and online. We're just going to maybe wait a minute or two, and then we will start the session just to allow people to enter the CICG venue and more people to join potentially. So give us 2 minutes. All right. So as I said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion from Humanitarian Partnership Network and Partnership Week. This session is part of the area of common concern of integrating security risk management into humanitarian action. And this session is a joint effort between the Global Interagency Security Forum and UNHCR. So just a few points on logistics and administration. The session and the discussion will last about an hour. Then the audience will be able to ask questions both on the Q&A function of the discussion, the panel, for those of you who are online. And for those of you who are in the room, please raise your hands and you'll be given the opportunity to ask your question. So regarding the session, as humanitarian organizations operate in increasingly complex contexts, in volatile and high-risk environments, ensuring the security of staff, partners, and affected communities is more critical than ever. Ensuring secure and sustainable access to people in need is both costly and valuable. A comprehensive approach to security risk management, encompassing staff security, access, training, and more aspects of security risk management, demands sustained investment, both in financial resources and organizational commitment, significant time and expertise, which also comes with a cost. Yet, as these costs increase and budgets unfortunately stagnate, or in some cases shrink, many humanitarian actors struggle to secure adequate resources for security risk management. So this panel discussion will explore the current state of funding for security risk management in the humanitarian sector at large, addressing the structural challenges that affect organizations at all levels. Discussions will focus on how to optimize resource allocation and allocate for dedicated funding, beyond the overheads, and demonstrate the critical value of investing in security risk management to ensure aid worker safety and security and effective humanitarian action. So it is my pleasure to be joined today by a few panelists here and virtually or online. So first and foremost, apologies from David Petru, the director of the Security Division of the World Food Programme, who will not be able to join us today. Here is John Novakovic, the director of the Global Interagency Security Forum, GISF, and with us online, Sudhanshu Shikhar Singh, the founder and CEO of Humanitarian Aid International, and Sebastian Bridgman, Global Security Lead Crisis Manager for EWDE. Sebastian, please do not ask me to pronounce or even spell EWDE. My German is not very good, based in Germany. And my name is Eric Le Guin, and I work with UNHCR in the Field Security section, and I will be moderating the session today. So we will start with a first question, which is a more generic one. But what is the current state of funding for security risk management? And are there any barriers or main barriers facing security dedicated funding in security risk management? And maybe as a subset, is it about donor receptiveness, or is it internal barriers within organizations to dedicate the appropriate or the adequate level of resourcing for security risk management? John and Sebastian and Sudhanshu.
Thanks, Eric. I'll have the first stab at that question. For context, I am solely speaking from the NGO perspective. We have 130 INGO members, but I think there's quite a lot of overlap with our colleagues at the UN on a lot of these points. The state of funding for security risk management. I think it's important to have a look at how funding has worked in general for security. And I'd use two words that start with F to describe it. Not the one you might think, but the first would be fractured. The way that security funding in an NGO is funded is through two primary ways. One is that direct project funding. So there's a budget line in the project's budget. It says for security, and you've got the dedicated security function to that. And even then, there might be different elements around access where there's overlap, and maybe digital security if that's relevant. So you've got it in different pots within there. But where a lot of the heavy resources for NGOs are funded from is their unrestricted budgets. And that is usually funded by the indirect cost recovery. I don't want to do too much inside baseball, but those indirect costs, the overhead costs that NGOs get when they receive a grant. So it might be 7% from the EU, from the US, or sometimes 20 to 25%. And those costs were always intended to be for the printer cartridges, all those small things that you didn't deserve their own budget line. But increasingly, security was funded by those unrestricted costs. And that funding would go to the more senior elements, the more experienced elements and resources that sat at the regional level or at the global level. So they were never really fully accounted for. So that's what I mean when I say fractured. And the other F word I would say is a false economy. And what we're starting to see that just now. There were a lot of non-negotiable parts of the security ecosystem that are necessary for projects to be delivered, for the work to reach the communities that are in need, which were detached completely from those project budget lines. And when I talk about this, the enabling infrastructure, it's the INSOs, it's the UNHAS, it's the UNDSS, it's GISF, it's the data, it's all those things behind, which, to be honest, the US was doing the heavy lifting on. They were doing a lot of the funding of some of those. And so there was a false economy there where a donor would allocate money to deliver a project, but that didn't really take into account of the costs of some of that supporting infrastructure. And this has just been built up organically, this system. The system security has become much more professionalized in the last 20 years. And this is very organic growth, and as new ways of working emerged, we would do those. But what it is it's shown itself now to be quite fragile. And that's the concern that's coming out in the last 2 months. And it's not just the US. The US is simply one of many donor organizations who are reevaluating what sort of commitments they want to make to aid funding. But, and they have the prerogative to do that, and all donor governments do. But in terms of what they do say is that they want to keep responding to the most acute crises. We're going to cut our budgets on some of this, but we will still respond to the most acute crises. Well, that's where generally the most acute risks are. And so again, we need to be having a broader conversation around making sure that the funding is being allocated where it needs to go, where it can be most efficient, where it can be most impactful. So I'll stop there.
Right, thank you. A risk-based funding model. Is there also, and maybe Sebastian and Sudhanshu, you can join? Are there also you were thinking, you were discussing the percentage that's allocated on programming? Is there also within organizations sometimes using in these overhead costs in the 7%, sometimes difficulty to allocate the right resources for security?
Yeah, I think this will be a good segue for Sudhanshu to come in. You've got an average of about 2 to 2.5% of program costs for NGOs are allocated to security, and that's fine. That is what it is. We did a audit of some of the major donors' terms and conditions within their grants, and to see where the rubber hits the road. There's one thing for member states and donors to talk about their commitments to aid worker security and to that kind of thing, but then what's in black and white and what money is allowed and where that money is allowed to go, that's what's probably more important. We got a couple of really interesting outcomes from our members when we surveyed them. I think it was about 40% of NGOs saying that they had started a grant without adequate security coverage, so where they had unmitigated risks. But what really came out quite strongly was making sure the money goes to the right place. And they were finding there were a lot of barriers within the terms and conditions of getting adequate security and risk management funding to their local partners who are bearing far more of the risk a lot of the time.
Thank you, John. Sudhanshu, Sebastian, anything to add to what John just mentioned? Sudhanshu, you're on mute.
Okay, so Sebastian, do you want to go first or you want me to?
Sudhanshu, after you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Eric, for inviting me to this important panel discussion. And I'll represent the views of local and national organizations. I represent one. And I think we are having this discussion now because the recent decisions have shaken the most resource-rich organizations. So now this is a kind of unusual shock which big organizations have faced, which they were not accustomed of, and that's why it's a major discomfort to the big organizations. So, but I wonder what is most of the local and national organizations, most of them are not very disturbed in current scenario because there is nothing new for them. They were already at disadvantage and their security concern was always secondary even prior to this funding cut. And before I come to my points, let me say that more than the funding cut, I'm worried for the reasons because of which funding has been brought down, and it's largely either to increase defense budget or to invest more on trade in southern countries on the pretext that it will help the local economy to grow. And I feel worried because defense budget means more offense, more wars, more conflicts, and trading also means perpetuation of the colonial pattern in the southern countries. Very recently, we conducted one study before this aid cut, and even the scenario for the local and national actors were not very different. Our study found out that even before, the resources were disproportionately allocated more to international NGOs at the cost of local and national organizations, whereas over 96% frontline workers faced any kind of violence, but they were their risk was not mitigated even prior to this scenario, while female workers constantly face risk of rape and sexual violence. That was also overlooked. The most alarming is that the frontline junior workers who are all they were almost left on their own because without any kind of perspective building, any kind of support to them on do's and don'ts or any kind of risk mitigation strategy for them. Our study also had a wider perspective of risk. So we did not only identify the security risk, but the risk overall risk environment, and we found out that it's not a new thing, that overall wage discrimination and lack of social security to them. And that's why Now it's very unfortunate that so many workers have to lose job overnight. They didn't know. That's very unfortunate. But the scenario for local and national actors were, even before, they were so lowly paid that quite a few, according to our study, 38% were doing two jobs to support them and to provide a quality of life to them. Now, it's very good that this shock has generated a lot of uh, discussions across the world. But whatever the way forward is, I think now this discussion will be very mindful of the conditions and plight of the frontline workers. That must be inclusive in whatever strategy we come up with. I stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Sudhanshu. Sebastian, anything to add on this question before I move to the next one?
Just to brief points to add, especially, I mean, I think John gave a great overview of the situation. So Sudhanshu has said most of the things. Just 2-3 things that I wanted to add to that. I mean, one is the funding situation is also worsened by the fact that we experience sector-specific inflation that is well above the average inflation we're seeing. I totaled up for my budget that we're seeing inflation anywhere between 8.5% and 11% on factor costs. So whatever I have, whatever little and shrinking budget I have, does no longer fit the increasing costs I see. The second reality is for most organizations, and I'm speaking very much from a security guy, so bottom-up perspective, so to speak. And I think what we're seeing massively is that other sources of funding are drying up as well. Maybe not as transparently as the USAID funding cuts, but even just free donations, which we often use to supplement overhead costs, such as security, are going down significantly, and that creates a massive problem. The last bit that I wanted to add is there is what John called a false economy. There were certain services provided to us, but there's also the fact that in an aid or development environment, other actors are providing services that we use in the end. So medical care, for example, in many of the most challenging places, is provided by others. We don't work in medical care, and we rely on that medical care to sustain a safe working environment for our employees and our partner organizations. And the fact that we have this drawdown shakes some of these existing capacities that I now have to supplement via my own, via the marketplace, which again costs me money. So I think that the funding situation is quite dire indeed. Thank you.
So unfortunately, quite a dire picture or a bad picture on the first question. One of the struggles sometimes for organizations is to explain security risk management, is showing the value, how we demonstrate the value of security risk management to donors. And I'm thinking, how can we collectively, and how can organizations show this value of security risk management beyond just compliance and overhead costs? Is there a way that we can demonstrate this and demonstrate the impact this would have on programming? Anybody?
Sudhanshu and Sebastian, feel free to jump in. I'll just...
Okay, if you want me to, I can start. Okay, so now, Eric, my own opinion is that the moment we start facing funding crisis, we start getting worried how to find new sources to get funding. And this is what I'm very skeptical about. And I'm also worried about that extreme monetization of our sector, that for everything, we need money. And if there's no money, we start struggling to continue. Now, we know from our experience that funding scenario is not going to change, at least in near future. Rather, it may get worse from hereafter. My suggestion is, my own thinking is that when money in volume is not going to go up, let's reprioritize how we utilize the money, and we can optimize the utilization pattern of the money available. I feel that in recent years and decades, there has been excessive focus on distribution. overlooking any other processes of seeking solutions, peace building, etc., etc. And human resource also became secondary to material distribution. Now, if we have to show aid effectiveness to donor, what we need to do when we talk about humanitarian reset, my own argument would be we start prioritizing humanitarian resource more than resource distribution. This is what we can do. Because if we have quality human resource at the ground level, at the frontline level, then they can build on the resources available within the community and around to continue with the humanitarian responses, and also pursue the nexus approach. This is what I would strongly advocate. And very recently I was having a discussion about DRC, where the crisis is acute, but at this time most of the international actors are deserting, and international workers are also being evacuated. And the argument is that since there is a massive risk to international workers, we need to evacuate. So my counter argument is that if international workers have to be evacuated when risk is high, local frontline workers are still there, and they will continue in the midst of extreme risk. So when they can continue and face the risk, why can't they work when there is less risk? So give more priority to frontline workers, let them lead the response, invest on them, give more wages to them, appropriate wages to them, work on their social security, and let frontline workers lead the response with complementary support from. So this will ensure overall operational efficiency, and that I think with that we can give a lot more confidence to donors. One last point is, to me it looks like, because ours is a very small organization, we operate with very small budget, I think security is a lot more software than hardware. A lot of things we can do with perspective building, with support and suggestions from competent organizations like GISF, than having really 2% or 3% of our funding to do something. So this another change I would like to advocate. I stop here.
Yeah, Sudhanshu, great. Keep those ideas, because we're going to speak about innovation and the way forward. But on the discussion, which is sometimes difficult for some organizations to show and demonstrate the value of security risk management and the necessary funding that needs to come with it, is there an effort? Is there a way organizations can demonstrate the value of SRM? I don't know. Is the number of incidents or the absence of incidents any sort of indicator of how good security risk management may be? And so, how do we pass this message so that funding is considered when there are potential issues? Sebastian, do you have any points on this one?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Look, let me state how I see the situation at the moment. I think there has been a significant pivot on perspectives, especially on security management, but on potentially the aid sector overall. When I talk to donors, for example, at the German Federal Ministry, we have had 54% in humanitarian aid, a cut in humanitarian aid end of last year. We're now hearing in the background that we will have a further cut by 35%. So to describe this to you, we're not cutting fat or muscle, we're cutting straight into the bone. And the discussion has pivoted from a discussion that was around, okay, this is what you want to do. Do you have the enabling factors budgeted in that enable you to do this, towards, well, we have to cut. We know we have to cut into something vital. Do we really need security, or can't we just do it without? How much has really happened? And there we are a little bit a victim of our own success, having good security management. Our track record of suffering losses is actually pleasantly low. How do we respond to this? I mean, if you stop measuring your efforts, then you're dead, right? Nobody will give money to something that's entirely invisible. But I think we need to change the way that we do this. I mean, there was a bit of a KPI fetish in our industry. I think that has to go away, simply because we don't have the resources to measure ourselves as well anymore. But measurements, KPIs, are an opportunity cost issue. We still have to measure, but we have to keep it down to the essentials. Number two, we have to change the way we deal with our failures. We have to be way more transparent. We have to show what the lack of security is causing, both to ourselves and, more importantly, to our partners, who I agree with Suanshu that they are bearing the brunt of this, and we have to be far more vocal. We have to become the spokespeople of our industry where there is very little security, which tends to be the frontline workers. And last but not least, we need to understand how to talk to our donors. I think to a certain extent, we have to educate them on the value of security. We have to educate them on the value of partner security, which I consider almost more important. And this is a continuous process. We haven't been very successful in this in the past, and now that sort of we're in a pinch, we have to become much better at that. Thank you.
To build off Sudhanshu and Sebastian's points, I completely agree with Sudhanshu that the answer in the past has always been more money. And maybe fortunately, that's not an option at the moment. So we do have to think a little bit more critically. And to go back to your original question, Eric, about demonstrating the value of investing in SRM, well, it's about a return on investment, isn't it? And there's a bit of, again, another fracture there when we're talking about locally employed staff versus international staff, when you can't assess the value the same way because, let's be honest, nationally employed staff's lives are valued monetarily less than expat staff, and that's just the honest truth. And there's plenty of evidence for that, whether that's about the level of insurance coverage or the amount of money spent on mitigating the risks that affect them or the appetite for risk transfer. So that is maybe not something right now to look at, but if you're talking about the value of security, you need to look about what you're trying to achieve and so what you're prepared to spend. On Sebastian's point, measuring the impact of security, I think that generally it might be a bit of an oversimplification, but it usually comes down to if somebody dies, you haven't spent enough, and if nobody dies, you're accused of spending too much, and you've gold-plated it. I agree with Sebastian as well, and this about the lack of security. The lack of transparency around incidents. We speak about the fact that in 2023 and 2024, there were record-breaking years for recorded aid worker deaths. However, there's vast underreporting, and that's particularly in terms of nationally employed staff. And it comes back to Sudhanshu's point again about money, is that national organisations are disincentivised from reporting of incidents because they don't want donors or their intermediary partners to think they can't deliver, to think that they've lost control of the situation. So there's underreporting there. Having said all that negative, but I think realistic stuff, donors, from the conversations I've been having, even last year, this year, donors are increasingly looking at security as an enabler rather than covering their heads in a compliance issue. So they're willing to have that conversation. They understand the principle that to get to those hard to access areas, to get to where you need to be, right? You do need security. Security is part of the broader access function as well. We're working on, I was just talking to a colleague earlier, we're working on a return on investment model to try and use some of that data that does exist, and we've got plenty of data to try and start to generate what is the quantitative or the monetary return on money spent on security. And yes, there is going to be some inherent flaws in that, but we are trying to push the conversation a little bit. One, to justify money that is spent on security, but also so that we make sure we are not gold plating mitigations, because if we can reduce costs safely on one mitigation, that means that we can use it in another part of the program.
Yeah, which brings me, I mean, those are ways forward to try to see a return on investment, a value in funding security risk management. But now, going forward in the particular context where funding is reducing, stagnating maybe, but reducing definitely. What additional efforts are required? You just mentioned it. It's sometimes rethinking, reprioritizing, looking at over securitization in certain parts. Is there an effort that needs to be done here? Also looking at costs. I mean, costs are increasing for security. The cost of doing business is increasing, and so what are innovations? What are ways forward where we can maybe collectively or at our levels look at innovation, by lack of a better term, and in our discussion with donors to ensure that we can get again the funding that is available at the right person, at the right level, and in the right operations.
I'll jump in to start this one and then provide some points for Sebastian and Sudhanshu to come in on. So we, GISF, had a conference about 3 or 4 weeks ago with a number of 70, 80 odd NGO security staff, plus some UN reps, plus donors, plus NGO networks to look at how you can do more with less in security. And to be honest, a lot of those lessons can be applied to other parts of the aid sector as well. Why I like working with security people is because they're very pragmatic and they will look at it and say, right, we need to pivot, we need to change, we need to do things differently now. And people were very open and acknowledge that we are going to need to do things differently. And there were some very practical outcomes that came from that. I mean, they're not groundbreaking in innovation. I think that's good because it's not like an AI enabled or something which is going to cost lots of money. It's just some simple practical ways. And a lot of it is about using what we already have, avoiding overlap. So looking at pooled security services. So NGOs buy a lot of the same thing from a lot of the same people at different rates, at different markets to achieve the same end. How can we better use our collective weight, for instance, to negotiate prices down from commercial providers? Sounds pretty basic, but actually, we already have the infrastructure in place to do that. We already work together quite closely. Others are, we heard some really interesting case studies from some of our NGO members around pooling their resources, not just within a consortia environment, but outside of a consortia environment. Right, you might be in a medium risk country. There are 3 NGOs. We've got limited budget. Well, let's all chip in and we'll employ one security person, a good quality, experienced security person to service the needs of those 3 NGOs. Again, not rocket science, but because of the highly regulated nature of the industry and concerns about liability, they will require a bit more thinking about that, and also buy-in from donors, so the donors are willing to say, yes, we accept that you've covered the liability by doing that, even though it's a bit unusual, but we'll work with you on that. And I am hearing positive noises from donors to be open to some of these more unusual approaches. And there's interesting ways that NGOs are looking at generating income. Security is not generally something when you see an advertisement in the newspaper or on TV or the internet and NGOs are calling for money. It's not usually to support the security function. In fact, we usually try to downplay the security function. We like to keep it nice and fuzzy and fluffy and butterflies and rainbows. But I think that NGOs are looking at, well, how can they sell the services that they have, sell the expertise that they have to appropriate commercial partners to generate new income streams for the security function? How can we work with commercial providers better? How can we get unique sponsorship from foundations, from philanthropies, from commercial companies to support that? And I think, but to get that over the line and to progress that, we do need to come back to what you've said before, the question you had before. What is the value of security? We've never had to explain that to people outside of our little circle, and we need to get better at that.
No, just to go back and on your point about pooling resources, making sure. Not necessarily that I see a change, but I was involved at the very inception of ANSO. In Afghanistan, which was a way by a donor to recognize a need and to try to serve instead of funding security officers or advisors in every organization. And the same thing was replicated with efforts which were not necessarily successful in Liberia, in Balochistan, if I'm not mistaken. So at the same time, you had these efforts which have gone down. I think a lot of, or at least my perception is that a lot of NGOs and organizations have decided to go with their own security because of a particular need, because of a particular mandate, a particular programmatic delivery or modality which required internal and specific security risk management. But maybe that's a way to go back is, as you said, those pooled resources and making sure that instead of serving 3 organizations, you can serve the 3 with one expert on the field. Sebastian, Sudhanshu, anything on this? In what additional efforts are required? What innovations can the aid sector at large can look at?
Sancho, should I go ahead?
Okay, so I entirely agree with what John said. A few points from my side is that see, all the humanitarian agencies talk about strengthening resilience of the communities, at-risk communities. No, but this shock has demonstrated how the entire sector lacked resilience. No, one big shock, and there is so massive impact all over, and it will take a significant time to overcome that. Now, at this point in time, we have to reimagine the system. So we have to take a pause and just think that how the sector has evolved since Second World War, and whether it was heading in the right direction. Of course, it wasn't, and that's why several reform processes were undertaken and none yielded desired results. Now, when whenever there is a crisis, that's the best time to come up with the best solution. And now this crisis should actually help us to find a pragmatic solution, and we need to walk the talk whatever we come up with. I personally feel that now is the time to reimagine the sector and stop talking about localization, but start talking about relocalization. Because localization is also very universal approach with a lot of ambiguity and different interpretation, and also manipulation at times. We should start talking about relocalization and move from universal approach to pluriversal approach, and that's the best way to minimize the resource need. Hugo Slim has said in his book, no, Solferino, that sector has become so expensive that often the agencies need humanitarianism much more than the population we claim to be serving. And that's a very direct statement, but no one can completely deny that whatever he said is wrong. So we need to reflect on that and move accordingly. And also we need to think that rigidity with principles, whether it is helping or not. For example, principle of neutrality. Sometimes that is made so rigid that that restricts operation also, and that means we are responding to a crisis, and we can reach to all the affected population, because there we have compromised the principle of neutrality. What is important is to reach the affected population. Access is much more important, so we have to be pragmatic than being very rigid with the principles. I stop here.
Thank you, Sudhanshu.
Let me carry on the torch in that case. Let me maybe add 3 things to the discussion. My feeling right now is that, and somebody in a recent conference mentioned this. I'm stealing this. This is a little bit like the Roadrunner, right? Wile E. Coyote has gone off the cliff and is hanging there before, falling down. And to a certain extent, this innovation bit is quite dangerous, right? So what I'm seeing is that the management of my organization, but also of other organizations, is now desperately coming up with new sources of funding, new sources of doing things differently, forgetting that you don't reinvent the wheel easily and at no costs. So I'm a little bit skeptical. What I do firmly believe what we need to do going forward is, number one, I think collaboration, as we will pick on later, is a crucial thing. That means whatever I do, I need to do in a way that the product of my work, security advice, training, etc., needs to be plug and play for somebody else, so I can pass it on, right? So I need to think a lot more about my products, my work outcomes, in terms of adaptability. I think that is one important point, especially when it comes to adapting then these learnings or these products to our local partners. I think the second point is we all know there are parts of our portfolio of services that we buy that are essential, and there are parts of our services that are nice to have. We need to think about that very hard and reevaluate that and think about how we can maybe replace processes that make our life easier in the short term against something that we either buy in the market or, more importantly, do ourselves. Last but not least, we have to become clearer on what we can do and what we can't do. I think there are innovations out there where, and I think GSF is doing an excellent work on that, where we can pool efforts. There are issues where, you know, the use of AI will change our sector fantastically, especially when it comes to analytical processes. Is now the time for me to engage in that? No, because my budget is shrinking, my workload is increasing. I cannot actively engage in that. So I need to pick and choose what innovations I can join and basically be very, very focused on the return on investment here, while keeping an eye out to those that I work with in the various countries and that I want to enable as far as I can. Thank you.
Yeah, John, I jump in this response. I was just thinking as Sudhanshu and Sebastian were talking, one of the reevaluations that will need to happen in the new environment, in the Wile E. Coyote over the cliff moments, as we're thinking about whether or not we're going to fall down. And so we're reevaluating previous red lines. We would never have done that. Maybe we'll do this. I think that there are still some internal elements or hesitations about how much we're willing to change and whether or not we can suppress egos. You know, there's always going to be a instinct to say, oh, we could outsource this or we could share this, but we're quite special and we really need this really specific advice, this really specific incident analysis. We need this specific type of vehicle to be able to get where we need to go. And so there's going to have to be a bit of a culture. You're either going to have to accept it or at some point someone's going to force it down your throat. And I imagine in the UN system, there's going to be similar discussions, all the UN SMS agencies, you have your own security functions, but you have UNDSS, which is like a big collective function, but the agencies like to do things their own way in some ways. So you're going to go through, I would imagine, a similar bit of ego swallowing at some point.
I wouldn't call it ego swallowing. I would just say understanding where the added value is and where there is a specific need. Security officers are fulfilling a role. We have, and I speak for UNHCR, security of persons of concerned person. We serve forcibly displaced population, and this is an additional task that we are upskilling our workforce with, and we want this particular part of our positions and our job to continue. And this is where we are looking at where are we making the biggest effect for the investment. So again, it goes back to the question of a return of investment and training and getting somebody in that position and explaining that there is a need for particular specific things, but also discussing with other agencies and other organizations to try to find out where there is a commonality and where there is potentially a discussion to be had.
Yeah, that comes back to what I think Sebastian said earlier. Everyone's got to be a lot more transparent about where they're weak, where they're strong, where they can add the most value.
Which brings us, all this discussion brings us to the question of collaboration. So we just mentioned it in collaboration with the UNSMS organization, but also now, how do we have this collaboration put together? How do we ensure that we have this collaboration to discuss this? Because in a world where it is going to be a bit of a competition now for funding, is like, how do we collaborate to ensure that we can get the appropriate level of funding where it's really needed? Is there an effort, more of an effort, because I think collaboration has happened and has been taking place for a while, but is there more that we need to do in terms of collaboration?
Can I start? Yeah, two quick points, sir, on this. First, as our sector has become so competitive, and there is excessive obsession that if this year my turnover was 5 million, then next year it should be 10 million. And so this cutthroat competition, uh, because of this cutthroat competition, we have compromised on coordination. And often I have seen that when we service the affected population, there is a mismatch between what is the need and what is being delivered, because proposals were not built on the needs, rather according to the availability of funds. And then the same population is serviced twice, thrice with the same kind of support. And then if we have improved coordination, then there will be a lot more operational efficiency, which will help us to use it on other underserved areas such as security. That's number one. And for that, we need a little more commitment to have coordination and avoid duplication. Second, all of us do not need, and I think John referred to that point again. I'm underlining that because I got that support from John and GISF. We don't have any kind of security budget. We don't have any security expertise within, and we were desperately looking for that. And thankfully, we got it from GISF. A majority of local and national organizations only need this kind of support, an expert agency like GISF who we can approach and ask for the support as and when needed, instead of everyone trying to have the similar kind of infrastructure within their agencies. And that will be a lot more efficient, cost efficient as well. Over.
Sorry, Sudhanshu, what you're saying resonates with a session that took place last week, which was about equitable risk sharing and localization. And I think that's one of the takeaway from the panel discussion was, there needs to be a cultural change, a safe space. I think that's where those were the two first takeaways, and ensuring that this discussion takes place, because a lot of we speak about funding right now, but a lot of the partnership and the risk sharing is about listening to the needs and ensuring that you can, as you said earlier, help and complement the existing knowledge, but understanding the needs first and making sure that you respond to the needs, whoever you may be, as part of the partnership. And I think that's one of the potential ways, yes, to look at it, is as we're going potentially more towards localization, sometimes as a way to lower risk, sometimes as a way to just build the capacity of local organizations. We need to look at this assistance. But Sebastian.
Yeah, let me come on with the nature of collaboration. Eric, you wouldn't call it ego swallowing, I would. I have swallowed a lot of my ego in the last 6 months. Look, the reality is most of the grant proposals or organizations, win or lose, are not won or lost on security. Usually the security people are, to a certain extent, removed from the operations, and there is to a certain extent a little bit of a brother/sisterhood going on. And still we're weird about sharing stuff. And we're still weird about, oh God, a shared resource, with that organization. They don't share the same beliefs. We're very, there is a little bit of a territoriality going on. And the same with our partner organizations. Most of my partner organizations obviously don't work to the standard that I'm able to work to. Nonetheless, they often have crucial insights. Now that the funding situation has gotten significantly worse, I'm forced to, rely on those insights, where before I had information supplies, and of course that helped. So to a certain extent, this ego swallowing process is very good. I think to a certain extent, we also have to be honest to each other. These cuts are so fundamental that many organizations won't survive them. And we have to, for a lot of our colleagues, this will mean their organizations are dying, and they have to die with a spot of dignity. And there will be some, organization in their death throes usually are not, emphasizing security. So let's, show them some solidarity and help them out, even if we know that this, the end of the road is approaching. I wanted to raise one last point, because that bit often gets forgotten. Mind your suppliers. We are talking about collaboration among other aid organizations, but providing what I do hinges on a couple of very, very important suppliers. And I know these suppliers are giving me better terms as a sort of mid-sized to small organization that they are giving to the German federal government or, others that buy their services from them. Now they are struggling. Many of them are talking very openly to me because I come from a private security background, and I know some of them are in dire straits. I think one of the things we also have to think about is which ones of those that supply services to us can we afford to lose, and which ones can't we afford? We're always talking about UNHAs. We're always talking about, and what about the training providers, the other solutions, the safer edges that go to places and train our staff? Can we afford to lose them? I think that is, for me, an important part on collaboration. Last but not least, we have to become very, very honest where we are, right? I think all of us have the tendency to sugarcoat the situation our organizations are in to a certain extent. And this is, again, kudos to GISF. I'm not going to, give a verbatim from the organization's perspective, but I think John set a great example by saying how dire the straits are for some in the industry. And I encourage everybody to be very honest and seek help where you need it, and don't wait for it to be too late. There is help out there, and most of us, when approached, are happy to collaborate, happy to give. No strings attached. Thank you.
I was not trying to deny the ego swallowing. I think that's the term that you use. I was just trying to be diplomatic. I was just trying to say, there are other organizations in the room, and I don't want this to be to be mildly offensive. But I'm just going to say, yes, I tend to agree that I think the situation is going to have to push these questions and put them on the table about the comfortable situation all of us have been for a while, and the new reality, and how do we navigate this, particularly as we're having conversation between agencies and between organizations, and ensuring that for the benefit of all, this this ego or this territoriality must be looked at critically. And so this is how I think the effort that's going to take place. I think everybody right now is in a situation where the news is still so fresh, and the consequences are not fully grasped or totally grasped, and so people are still looking at it. But this is something that's definitely, as part of collaboration, going to be looked at maybe a little bit more critically. I just want to finish on maybe changes, and this time looking at how do we interface with donors. Are there any particular changes on policy and funding mechanisms, things that we would like to recommend to improve the current state? Now, it's going to be difficult to discuss improvements and changes when people are hinting to a reduction, but is there something that can be looked at to try to maintain the level of funding that's necessary after everything that we've discussed has been put in place, after people are discussing the value of SRM, discussing the return on investment, making sure that there is a prioritization, making sure that the territoriality that may have existed in the past is looked at critically and disappears potentially. Is there anything else? Is there a last potential solution as we are engaging with donors, or not last solution, but another recommendation that we can look at, particularly with donors?
I would suggest. So I'm actually. So there is you're right. There is not. You can't innovate, save, scrape the barrel until there's not an empty barrel. There is a minimum level of funding required. So apologies to Danshu. The answer is sometimes a little bit of money to be able to do these things. But that amount of money required is largely dictated by two things that donors, member states have control over. One is, well, really boringly, negligence laws, liability legislation, etc., which is what organizations have one eye on when looking at how they mitigate risks, because they don't want to be found wanting if something does go wrong. So that is just a basic fact. And the other is, of course, around IHL compliance, because the less compliance you have with IHL, then the more work and the more demand is put onto UN agencies and NGOs to actually manage risks. And generally those risks are at the top end and require the most sophisticated mitigation, which is expensive. What I'm really quietly confident or pleased to hear is that the member states are not just looking at IHL at the moment. So we had resolution 2730 last year, and saying all the right things, great. But then you have this ministerial group of 8 countries, which Australia is driving, and they're making the right noises about saying, right, yes, there's IHL compliance and we need to work on that, but there's stuff that we can do in the meantime as donors, as member states, to support security risk management at a practical level, because they're 2 different things. One's a political element, one's a practical element. So and you haven't in the past haven't always got that practical element getting much focus. So I'm really pleased to hear that, and I think that from a broader risk management perspective, like an atmospheric level, what we can't do, and I would hope that people much more senior than me are thinking about this in terms of the whole aid sector, is not have single dependencies ever again. It's as much everybody else's fault, the NGOs, the UN agencies, other member states, that we became so reliant on a single donor. And from a risk management perspective, somebody should have said, that's a big risk. And so I think that a collaborative approach from donors, looking at security, but looking at everything more broadly, is what needs to happen.
Sudhanshu.
Yes, so given the limited time available, let me just share a few bullet points. The first, if the donors have to, and clear message to donors, if there is less money available, then of course less money for program, but human resource costs must not be reduced, because if there is human resource on the ground, they can manage with even limited resource. That's very critical, and that must not be compromised. Second, duty of care and social security of particular frontline workers should be non-negotiable in every project program supported by donors. And third, there is racism, inherent racism in the sector, which must be addressed in all. Don't give different values to different lives. Life of a frontline worker is as important as of an expatriate. Give same value to all. Broaden the perspective risk. It's not only wars and conflicts where a worker is at risk, but rather it's also in any flood affected area, drought affected area, the risk is high. One weird suggestion is that consider security budget as program cost, not operation cost and overhead cost, because it's about people. And most of the frontline workers also come from the communities they are serving. Last is that most of the decisions are influenced by political economy, and that has created aid industry complex. There's not a word, but I have just coined that the decisions influenced by political economy make situations much more complex. So following GST principles, can we donors move from political economy to humanitarian economy? That's not a word, I just created it because it goes well with political economy. Over.
Thank you, Sudhanshu. Sebastian?
Two points on this. I think number one, so the discussion I'm seeing in Germany may be slightly different, but I'm seeing at least traces of that in the UK and the US as well. To us, it's increasingly communicated by our main donors that in the future there will be a shift in the available funds. Not only will they be smaller, but they will also be more closely tied to our foreign policy interests, right? Which is, the whole idea of, to work where the need is greatest is a little bit off the table. Now, this, to a certain extent, and there's a huge discussion about the efficiency of aid, right? And of course, if I pump money into an environment where the need isn't greatest and the resources on the ground aren't as challenging, their efficiency is easier shown. Let's put it this way. As a result, my life as a security person may get easier, not in the short term, but in the mid to long term. right? If I'm no longer going to these very hard places that, some of us work for, then security risks are lower, medical risks are lower, kidnapping risk may even be non-existent. I think to a certain extent, this is a trend that will happen to our industry. Now, it is upon our organization, not necessarily in security, but the wider organization, to keep the advocacy up to those places less fortunate, where operations are much, much harder, the Somalias, the Sahel region, where we struggle to operate. Because the problem that I'm seeing is if more and more actors withdraw from there, those that remain will have an impossible mission to work on the ground. So I think advocacy for aid to the very hard places, to the dire places, is very important. I think that is a crucial point for all of our organizations. Just to a certain extent, you want to keep the donors in bad faith, to help them understand what they're doing by prioritizing places that are easier to reach. That's number one. Number two, the discussions I have, especially with the German Foreign Service, center a lot around, oh, you know what, there are these actors, they're fantastic, they basically have no overhead, they just send volunteers there. I don't know if they even have insurance, but you really get a lot of bang for the buck. This obsession with bang for the buck I find very, very dangerous as a security person. Of course, when I said earlier that we have to be transparent about failures, we have to be transparent also about the failures of those black sheep that we have in our industry. There are organizations who trample on the right of their workers, the right of their partners, etc. We have to be more transparent and outspoken. There's always this cartel of silence around this, where basically we know about what screw-ups are happening. We're just keeping mum because you don't do that. You don't tell on others. We do have to. I mean, because otherwise, I think it's too easy for our donors to push money into areas where people really have forgotten how to take care of their people and of their partners. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And I think that needs to be part of our advocacy going forward as well, where this indeed is something where the security people have to reach out to our donors and say, look, this doesn't work, right? Be aware of the costs of this. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Sudhanshu. Thank you, Sebastian, for the panel part. We're not over yet. We're not over yet. Now we're getting in on the Q&A. So as I said before in the introduction, I already have a question in the Q&A from somebody who's online. But so please post your questions if you haven't done so. We have one. So either it's going to be a very long answer or it's going to be relatively short. And we have one in the room. So I will go with the one online, just as it was posted a few minutes ago. So Sudhanshu, Sebastian, John, myself as well, does anyone on the panel have any examples of funding proposals that have separated out security risk management and post-incident staff care? And I'll stop there. Security risk management, post-incident staff, not as a bundle, but separated them.
So USA and BHA were quite good at budgeting for security. I would say they were quite progressive. So you would have they would say, well, what's the cost of doing the task? And then separately, right, what's the cost of providing security for that task? And then separately, the indirect costs, the micro, etc. So they very much gave you the space so that you weren't having to make sacrifices on one to deliver the other, and then they could have a conversation, an honest conversation about security. I think that was a really good model. And certainly there's been great steps by some other donors to try and, to make sure that they pull out security from those indirect costs. I think that's quite widespread now, is that security does have its own budget line. And there are different elements around how that could be strengthened further still in terms of having better conversations, more honest conversations, having more agility and flexibility in those as the program progresses. I don't know of any specific examples around a specific budget line for, say, aftercare, and that's an important mitigation. Let's not, let's frame it in terms of being a mitigation in case something happens. But from when I've been talking to donors lately about these aspects of terms and conditions and budgeting, what they are saying is, if you're writing the proposal, tell us that you want to include this, why you want to include this. It's out of mitigation, and be upfront and honest, and then they can have that conversation. And there is still that barrier in those negotiations where you've got desk officer NGO or grants person NGO, grants person donor, and then the security people are over here. But we're being told, we're being encouraged to tell NGOs to try and have more honest conversations about those.
And I'm also wondering, just looking at the question, the security management and the post-incident staff care, is it also, because it sometimes is seen as different streams? One is security risk management, which is like prevention and mitigation on the incident, and then the post-incident staff care may be looked at both on the medical, psychosocial well-being, and then more human resource or administrative components of the response. So is that also sometimes why they do not fit in the same category on a request for funding or on a grant? So with security risk management, we'd often go about measures and procedures and.
Yeah, but some NGOs, CRS, their team is, and apologies to Marike, but it's health, safety, security, and maybe something else as well. That is all in the one team. And there are other NGOs who have the same. There are other NGOs who in their org charts are quite closely aligned with human resources because they're taking a holistic view of duty of care. But then there are a number of organizations which view that aftercare and general mental well-being as an employee perk. And so that would be funded out of their core funding rather than as a line item. But who doesn't get that consideration is the national NGOs and our national colleagues. So that's just not even, I don't think that's in the top 10 list at all in considerations.
And maybe that is in itself a subject for a panel. Sebastian, I see you nodding. I don't know if you have anything to add as an answer to the question.
Yeah, indeed. I think on security, my experience in the last sort of 15 years in various functions in the corporate sector and in the NGO sector is there's a convergence of what are acceptable levels of security and what not. So I don't see there is a difference between the corporate world and the NGO world, but it's one of degrees, not of talking completely at odds to one another. When it comes to post-incident staff care, that is something where I see much more disparate approaches to this topic from a cultural perspective. So typically in Germany, post-incident staff care is not something that falls even in the realm of the employer's responsibilities, as long as it's psychological damages rather than physical constraints. This is where just a function of the legal tradition. In other areas, I know this is very much prioritized. I've worked in Britain on various projects that emphasize this. But I think here you're seeing a very different, more heterogeneous landscape than overall. In terms of funding possibilities for both, I think there is more of and I agree with John, there's more of an attitude that security needs to be included both on the preventative and the incident related crisis management side. And I think on the post-incident staff care, that is still an issue, even in my organization there, where we are making first steps into sort of the great beyond, where we're constantly learning. Thank you.
But I'm sure, I don't know if you have anything else to contribute to that.
We work with a number of grassroots organizations, and this even this question will shock them when there is not proper care when they are on job, and if something goes wrong, any kind of care, it's unimaginable for majority of frontline workers, and that I witnessed during COVID response now, which many international organizations try to present as a very good example of localization. But it was massive risk transfer with a little bit of more funding transferred to local organizations. But the amount of risk which was transferred, No one knows because it's not reported, as we discussed earlier also, how many frontline workers suffered or died. And when they die, they leave a very vulnerable family behind because throughout their working life, they were not getting adequate salaries. Their social security was not taken care of. And this is what we very strongly pitch, that they are human beings. Whatever we discuss in Geneva and Brussels, it gets executed by people who are rooted in communities and villages. They are our operational arm, but they are off the radar. Bring them on radar. They are human beings, very important. Give them value, what they deserve. Over.
Thank you, Sudhanshu. So we have a question in the room. I don't know if there's a microphone with two questions in the room. So please go. The microphones are on the table.
Josh Lyons. I just wanted to say thank you for all of the wonderful insights. I think there's several acute issues you raised that, given this dire situation financially, that's obviously going to get much, much worse. It does optimistically present a unique opportunity for us to discuss all of these issues in a way that, from a security perspective, we were never really institutionally allowed to discuss them. This is really this, in the same way the European security architecture is being discussed in a way that really has never been done before in this acute crisis. I think there's a parallel to have an equivalent humanitarian security architecture debate and discussion, starting first and foremost with the issue simply of the code of silence. Now, I worked operationally in the UN. I've worked for very, very luxurious human rights organizations that started their security conversations with body armor and very luxurious satellite phones and, this, that, and the other thing. There's this silence that we all are essentially mandated to adhere to, which is we're not allowed to talk about near misses. We're not allowed to talk about staff who are endangering other staff, and most importantly, beneficiaries and local contacts. We're not allowed to call out reckless and criminal negligent behavior on the part of sister agencies. And as a consequence, donors simply have no comprehension about the severity of the system. I mean, it's a miracle in my mind that more people aren't killed every day. Having that debate conversation is very hard for an aid worker to start, and nearly impossible also for security staff to start. And it has to be driven at a much higher institutional level. I don't really know how you provoke that, but one opportunity I think might be also to consider, for example, has anyone worked or contacted reinsurance agencies like Munich Re and Swiss Re, who have very robust internal research and funding structures, and they have a vested interest in obviously security risk management. And in a way, I think they might be able to provide sufficient resources and support that hasn't been, I don't think there's really been much outreach to them in the past. So I wanted to ask about that. Just one final point. I want to say every time I was in a debate or discussion about should we send someone with body armor, that was the moment when I would raise my hand and say, I think that's when we shouldn't send someone. The cost-saving opportunity here is that the safest way to protect staff is to not send them into hostile environments in the first place. In my experience working for the UN, 90% of international staff for natural disasters or in emergency response in complex emergencies, quote unquote, were completely unnecessary. There were local staff there who were qualitatively better suited and capable of responding, and they were marginalized and institutionally put aside. That for me it's an institutional problem of the way in which organizations fly the flag and raise money, to be quite frank about it. It is an absolute opportunity to really, really push back on the way in which we put people in harm's way when all they're doing is endangering themselves and others.
So one, I would agree with you that it's all of the points that we raise are discussions that need to happen. It's just unfortunate that these discussions need to happen under some sort of pressure. And I think it would have been great to have more time to discuss all of this when the situation was less dramatic or less dire. When it goes to the other point, and I will let people speak. I think, and I don't know when you have worked with the UN, but I think security risk management, I mean, when you were discussing sending an international staff with a body armor versus national staff, I do think that we are looking at security risk management for both international and national. And I think the measures are the same with both. I think it's a question of assessing the risk and why we are going to those places. And so the body armor, which is not there without a reason, is that we are providing a certain number of resources, a certain number of measures that we put in place in order to look at the outcome, which is a programmatic delivery that we're all considering. And it's constantly weighing in the delivery of activities and the security risk that we are having colleagues exposed to when they're delivering. And it's all this concept of balance and acceptable risk. So I think this is the body armor as a symbol is a measure in itself which allows us to continue being able to operate with reducing the risk. So this is the point that I wanted to make. And then John, Sudhanshu, Sebastian on the other points or additional comments on the answer.
Very briefly is on your point on the insurance companies. A couple of weeks ago, my members made it very clear that yes, we do want to go and be talking to them as part of our, dropping now any previous moral objections about using commercial money. Well, no, there's win-wins to be had, and so looking at that, and I'll just briefly touch on the invisibility of locally employed staff. In the last couple of months, when you've been seeing calls for donations, big international campaigns saying, come and fund my members, the people who pay my salary, saying, we are here, we're responding. And I'm like, no, you're not. You're sitting, you're sub-awarding all that. And there's this invisibility around our national partners. And that's a broader issue, but from a security perspective, it becomes it puts in place the barriers to providing the security resources they need if no one's even aware that they're there in the first place.
Sebastian, Sudhanshu, anything else to contribute? And you can say no, it's okay.
No, I have nothing more to add. Yes.
Let me jump on this. Thanks for the question. I'm still hung up on the luxurious. Let me just share this. I have yet to see a luxurious in the NGO world. When I was working for a corporate client years back, we had somebody who had a medical incident, and we were struggling to get care for that person. And the board member that I was talking to just turned around and asked me if I needed the plane, because obviously we had a plane to fly somebody out. And to be quite honest, the resources in the private sector on many of these issues, and if you're talking to the large insurance companies, the resource use is much vaster. I used to run crisis management exercises, and the budget for these crisis management exercises was in excess of 50,000 euros per day. And this is one day exercise, right? So I think we need to be careful when talking to the private sector, and when we talk about our risk insurance or risk management strategies and theirs, because as you rightly said, the idea of not sending people is much closer to what the private sector does than what we do. There is a fantastic amount of catastrophe and aid tourism going on. To a certain extent, I think I understand it when we need to generate the pictures that then in turn generate the donations and the grant money that we're all using. To a large extent, I'm sometimes wondering what we're doing in these places, constantly visiting, and what I feel there's a certain amount of entertainment that is being poured on us. And I think this is something that we need to question urgently, because I not only do I not see the sense of that, I also wonder to what extent are we fair to our partner organizations who certainly have better things to do than providing touristy attractions to me. I do wonder to what extent where we are going with this. I mean, there is a slump right now. Money is becoming more dire, and as a result, the market will, reset to a certain extent. I wonder whether then the funding situation will come up again, and we will then have funding again as it comes in, or whether we will have to cope with the current situation and maybe adjust our programming as a result. And I think that discussion is yet to be had. We're, as an organization, my organization is not there yet, and I don't think there are organizations in Germany that are having that discussion. I think we're very much under the assumption that let's wait, let's see, this will come back up again. I have certain doubts about that.
And just, I was going to say on the last point about the risk to internationals and sometimes assessed from afar, lower risk to nationals is something we need to carefully consider. I mean, I've been in situations where, yes, the general idea in the country was that because of a knowledge, because of connections, because of understanding of the context, in about 90% of the country, the risk was lower to some of our national colleagues compared to internationals. In one particular location, though, we had to be very careful not to replicate this assumption on that part of the country. We're suddenly in a civil conflict where ethnicity, language, past experience was looked at by the various parties to the conflict. The national colleagues would probably be at a higher risk, and where an international would, and I say would because fortunately the incident still happened, but would potentially not face the same level of risk, or at least different types of threats. So we need to be very careful on this. It's not a one size fits all. But I do understand, and this is a discussion that we had. I do understand that this has been for a long time. It's a risk strategy, a security strategy that has been put in place, which is like, let's go and transfer the risk to somebody who has a lower level of risk. And in the discussion that we had last week was to assess this, not make the blank statement that because it's a national partner, because it's a local actor, the risk is necessarily lower. But it's engaging in the discussion to understand this. I mean, I've been looking at it in an NGO world, having local partners. Do we have this conversation? Do we have this discussion with local partners? As opposed to just thinking that because there is a better understanding, there is necessarily a lower risk. And I think that's an important discussion to have as well. Sorry, I'm not used to having questions in the room. Usually they're so empty.
Hi, I'm Bill Blanchard, Director of Field Operations in DSS in the UN. We're facing both the direct impact from our extra budgetary funding from the USAID, but also the indirect effect in that we are largely funded by the UN agencies. So in the coming days, and they're all facing cuts, so in the coming days we'll know just how big the hit is on us, and we'll be working with the other agencies to see how we can sustain our work actually in the most urgent humanitarian scenarios as the priority. So it's reassuring Sebastian that we're not going to go down we're not expecting to be tasked or to go down the path of going for the easy options that meet member states' sort of narrower needs. And in the Emergency Directors Group, we're looking at precisely how do we ensure that we sustain the effort and the supporting efforts, which include the security effort in those difficult humanitarian contexts. I suppose my question to the team, we'll be looking at the efficiencies we can get across the security functions in various bits of the UN, because it's not all in DSS. And we've got a UN SMS review that will help us do that. My question is, how do we think about making efficiencies and improving the model between the UN and the NGO sector as we all face this common crisis? Because we could easily get siloed in our attempts to find efficiencies. How do we cross the big divide there? That's my question.
Can I?
Yes, Sudhanshu, while we're thinking here.
Okay. This is such a pertinent question, no? But first, we'll have to reflect that how we have undermined the overall efficiency of the sector in last few decades, particularly. And here I'm trying to bring in a bit of colonial angle also and Eurocentrism also, because I come from a national organization, but I work with international sector also. So from a national organization perspective, I feel there is so much of disparity between local, national, and international organizations that local and national organizations have always looked up to international organizations and tried to become mirror image of that by compromising their own unique characteristics. And most of our local organizations grow out of their own local realities, reacting to the problems and situations of their context. But majority of us tried to become mirror image of the Western organizations because that was ideal for us, and that led to constant. There is also one thing that if there is a big crisis, then majority of international actors try to have direct presence in the area instead of working through local and national organizations. When you establish your direct presence, you also inflate the local operational economy, because you come from different economy. Without understanding or respecting the local economy, you started operating in a different economy with your own economy that inflated. And because of that inflated operational economy, local organizations have been constantly facing brain drain, and they with very diminished intellectual capital. And that has impacted overall, even when we talk about localization, with reduced intellectual capital, local organizations are struggling to lead the response. So I think here we will have to just look. The crisis is the best time to reflect and do course correction. Overall operational efficiency is redefining our own role. Do we need to be present everywhere, or we need to facilitate someone who is already present and can do something better than us? But we are also good at something. How can we complement? This complementarity is the way forward to improve overall operational efficiency. Over.
Thank you, Sudhanshu. John, anything on the difficult question that Bill asked?
I bet I have asked, sir, because Bill and I sit on saving lives together. You know what? I think it comes back to what we said earlier. This reflects conversations we've had. I think that it comes back to that ego swallowing by everyone involved, being transparent and saying, what are you good at? What are we good at? And then knowing, are we doing some of the same things? Well, let's not do that. Who's better at it? And that transparency and openness and willingness to admit where others are better. I think that's going to be key to collaboration, whether it's amongst NGOs, amongst UN, or between UN and NGOs.
I could
yes,
agree. May I add to this one more point? And let me plug GISF so you don't have to, John. I think bodies like GISF are a natural facilitator for that type of discussion between large bodies like the UN and then groups of NGOs that are on security, I think on other topics as well, because we have to be mindful that this is not just a crunch on security funding, but on funding overall. And I think bodies where the industry self-organizes around topics like GSF are an important conduit to have that discussion and move it forward. So I think that type of engagement is crucial. Thank you.
I will ask the last question before we conclude. Maybe I would say between the three of you, because the question is, how do we formally raise the voices and needs of our national partners with institutional donors? What solution can you see for the wider group of NGOs and INGOs to help make donors more aware of these needs and focus support onto key areas? Continue what you've been doing, probably, or advocating, but is there... Sudanshu? Well, Sebastian, I mean, Sebastian, both as also interacting a lot with local actors and...
I appreciate that question. And the best way for international actors to support, to have better access to donor is decide where you need to withdraw and downsize. No, we face maximum problem for intermediary organizations, which is largely INGOs, because of their desire to expand, often at the cost of local organizations. So, and that malignant growth needs to be checked at least now. This is a wake-up call for all of us. I think quite a few donors are sympathetic, but they have to go through intermediaries, which is either UN agencies or INGOs. And now we need to move to tripartite partnership. Every agreement, if that could be tripartite, that will ensure transparency, and that transparency will lead us to solving many problems. So this is what my expectation is from intermediaries. They have always talked good things, but often not equally good to walk the talks. This is the time to do that. Over.
Question?
Let me, so if the question is, what can we do? What do we need to do better, particularly in response to donors? Let me butcher a quote by Steve Jobs. There was a stay hungry, stay foolish, never settle. I would say be painful, be unpleasant, and never settle. I mean, we really have to. There is a tendency by many of our donors to sort of stick the sand into the head and then the head into the sand, and not look at the costs that the cuts are creating, particularly, definitely in terms of frontline personnel, but also in terms of our own organizational values and the red lines we keep. If we choose to die quietly and sort of die by 1,000 cuts, that will be very unpleasant. And I'm afraid this will also kill the organizations that are best suited to do the type of work we do, and it will promote organizations that are, slightly unpalatable, at least to my norms and values when it comes to duty of care and staff well-being. So I think it's our duty to be loud, to be unpleasant, to be painful for our donors, and to remind them of their duties. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And on that note, unpleasant of a death of 1,000 cuts, I will put an end to this panel. So we'll wrap up this discussion. So thank you all online, and thank you for those of you who came in the room today. Thank you. So yeah, I think we're going to repeat most of what we said during this as a conclusion. Security risk management measures, procedures are not optional. It's essential to protect humanitarian personnel, partners, and ultimately the communities we collectively serve. And without adequate investment in security, humanitarian operations face stoppages, severe disruption, staff members face increased risk, and ultimately life-saving assistance may not reach those who need it most. Funding gaps remain a challenge, even more of a challenge, I guess, in the next couple of months. Yet I would like to believe that today, and during the hour and a half that we shared, we were able to hear valuable insights on how donors, the humanitarian organizations, can work together to ensure security is adequately prioritized and adequately resourced. Collaboration is key. I think we've heard this several times. Collaboration is key. Strengthening dialogue between donors, as Sebastian said as the last intervention. Implementing organizations and security experts will help ensure that security risk management is not seen as a burden, but as an investment in the effectiveness, sustainability, and impact of humanitarian action. I would like to thank Sudhanshu, Sebastian, John for their participation, and all of you for your engagement in this critical conversation. This is not an end. Let's take this conversation forward and turn challenges into potential concrete solution that will strengthen security for humanitarian operations across the board, and for the staff members, partners, and again, for the communities we've served. Thank you very much. Have a good end of the afternoon, and HNPW.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.